The wind carried the dust like an old song, the kind that clung to the bones of a man who had spent too many nights alone. Across the plains the sky burned with the last embers of daylight, that hush of violet and gold before the stars laid claim to the heavens. A single cabin stood there, small and weather-beaten, its wood grayed by seasons of storms and silence. Inside lived Lucas, a cowboy who had chosen quiet over company, the sound of his boots on wooden boards the only reminder that a man still breathed within those walls. He had built his life on solitude, not by desire perhaps, but by necessity. There were things he no longer spoke of, faces he no longer dreamed of, wounds that were best left unmeasured. That evening he had been mending a stirrup, fingers roughened by years of leather and rope, when he heard the faintest cry against the wind. At first he thought it no more than a trick of his weary mind. The prairie sometimes whispered when it wished to fool a man. But the cry came again, fragile yet desperate, and this time it carried words. He stepped out into the dusk and looked toward the horizon. What he saw halted his breath. Two small figures approached slowly, as though fighting against the vastness of the land itself. The older was a girl, no more than 6, her small arms straining to support the weight of the woman leaning upon her. Beside her trudged a boy, for years at best, his little hands clutching at the woman's torn shawl, his eyes wide with worry far older than his years. The woman herself, their mother, walked with difficulty, her body bent in pain, each step trembling, as though the earth rejected her frailty. Lucas watched in silence, his heart clenching in ways it had not for many seasons. The children carried both courage and terror in their eyes. When they drew near enough, the girl lifted her voice, though it quivered like a leaf in wind. "Settlers broke Mama's ribs. Can she rest in your cabin?" The word struck Lucas deeper than any bullet or blade. He stared at them, at the girl's brave defiance, at the boy's unsteady lip, at the woman whose face was pale with pain, but whose dignity had not yet been extinguished. For a moment the cowboy could not move. It was as if the world had forced his silence to face the innocence he had long tried to ignore. Lucas bent down, his voice low and shaken. "Come inside," he said, though he had not spoken so many words aloud in months. He reached gently for the woman, but she resisted with a faint shake of her head, unwilling to burden another. Still her legs faltered, and Lucas, with the care of a man who knew the weight of sorrow, lifted her into his arms. She was light, too light, the kind of frailty born not just from broken ribs, but from hunger and exhaustion. He carried her through the doorway as the children followed, wide-eyed but trusting. The cabin smelled of pine and smoke, a modest shelter, but warmer than the unforgiving night. Lucas laid the woman upon his bed, covering her with a wool blanket. The girl, Ella, clung to her mother's hand, while the boy John climbed onto the stool beside the bed, his small fingers tracing the edge of the blanket as if to ensure she would not vanish. Lucas stoked the fire, letting flames lick upward until warmth spread across the room. The crackling light fell upon the woman's face, revealing the sharp angles of her suffering and the soft resilience still alive in her gaze. She whispered her name, Luna, barely audible. The sound of it lingered in the air like the faint glow of a star that refused to be swallowed by the dark. Lucas repeated it softly, testing it as if it might vanish if spoken too loudly. He brought water to her lips, and she drank with gratitude, though pain carved lines across her brow. Ella spoke again, her voice steady though her eyes shimmered. "Mama tried to walk, but every step hurt. We didn't know where else to go." John nodded, adding, "We saw your light." Lucas's throat tightened. He looked at these children, these small souls already carrying burdens larger than the wide prairie itself, and something inside him stirred awake, something he had long ago buried beneath dust and regret. The night grew deeper, the stars spreading like silver dust across the heavens. Lucas cooked a simple stew, its scent filling the cabin with warmth. He served the children first, watching as their hunger overtook their shyness. Luna ate only a few spoonfuls before the pain forced her back against the pillow. Lucas did not press her. Instead, he set the bowl aside and sat quietly by the fire, his eyes resting on the shadows dancing across the walls. In those hours, silence was not emptiness, but a kind of communion. The children drifted into sleep, their small forms curled close together on a pallet Lucas laid near the fire. Luna's breathing was shallow, but steady. She watched Lucas from the bed, her eyes carrying questions she did not voice. Perhaps she wondered why a man alone would open his home, or perhaps she saw in him something she recognized. Loneliness meeting loneliness, sorrow answering sorrow. Lucas met her gaze only once before turning back to the flames, for in that gaze he felt a weight he was not yet ready to name. Days stretched slowly, each one weaving the strangers tighter into the fabric of his solitude. Lucas rose early, tending to chores as always, but now there were small voices greeting him, small footsteps following him to the door. He split wood while Ella carried kindling in her little arms, determined to help. John followed the chickens outside, laughing in delight when they scattered at his approach. And within the cabin, Luna rested, her body fighting to mend itself, her spirit refusing to bend. Lucas tended her ribs as best he could with herbs brought by Mrs. Callahan, the old widow who lived 2 ridges over. Mrs. Callahan was one of the few who had ever spoken kindly to Lucas in town, and when she saw Luna's state, she pursed her lips but asked no needless questions. She simply gave what she could and left with a nod, as though she understood that some wounds were not meant to be spoken of too quickly. In the quiet evenings, Lucas and Luna exchanged words, halting at first, but gradually finding rhythm. She spoke of her children's courage, of how Ella carried hope like a lantern, and how John's laughter could break through even the heaviest shadows. She did not speak of the settlers who had broken her ribs, not in detail, but Lucas saw enough in her eyes to know the story was written there in scars. He did not press her. He only listened, offering silence when words were too heavy. The children grew comfortable with him, their trust given freely, perhaps because they sensed that his silence was not indifference, but a shield he had long held up against the world. Ella asked him one evening why he lived alone. He paused, the fire crackling between them. Because sometimes, little one, a man believes he has nothing left to share. Ella frowned, considering this as though it were a riddle. But you shared with us, she said simply, before curling up beside her sleeping brother. Lucas looked at Luna then, and saw that her eyes glistened with quiet tears she tried to hide. Fear returned like a shadow on the horizon when news reached them that the settlers were still near, stirring trouble. A ranch hand passing by spoke of violence, of families displaced. Lucas felt the old tension rise in his chest, the instinct to prepare. He reinforced the cabin walls, sharpened his tools, and kept watch by night. He would not let harm reach these souls who had stumbled into his life like fragile birds seeking shelter. One night, while the storm outside lashed against the windows, Luna stirred in pain. She thought the children asleep and whispered broken apologies to them, sorry for being weak, sorry for slowing them, sorry for every bruise they had suffered on her account. Her voice cracked like dry wood, and Lucas, listening from his chair, felt his heart split. He rose, sat beside her, and though he found no words, he stayed through the long hours, his presence steady as the fire. She turned her face to him, tears slipping silently, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them. She saw that he did not view her as broken, but as someone unbearably brave, and he saw that her strength was the kind that humbled a man. The storm deepened, thunder rolling like the anger of the earth. The children woke in fright, clinging to their mother. Lucas moved swiftly, pulling them close, calming them with his steady arms. Luna tried to rise, but faltered, collapsing into his hold. Her breathing grew ragged, her pain overwhelming. For a breathless moment Lucas thought he might lose her, and terror, the kind he had long denied himself, surged through him. He whispered her name, Luna, again and again, as if the sound itself could tether her to this world. She opened her eyes, fragile but alive, and in that instant he could no longer hide what had been building within him. When the storm finally softened, when the children at last slept again, Lucas sat beside the bed. The firelight flickered across his face, his hands trembling slightly, though his voice was steady. He told her what he had kept buried, that her presence had broken through years of silence, that her courage had shown him a strength greater than any he had known. He told her she was not a burden, that she and her children had become his reason to draw breath each morning. His words were not grand, but they were raw, stripped of the walls he had once built. Luna listened, tears sliding down her cheeks. For so long she had been seen as wounded, as fragile, as someone to pity. But in his words she felt none of that. She felt seen as whole, as resilient, as worthy of love. She reached for his hand, gripping it with what strength she had left. Her lips trembled, unable to form many words, but the look in her eyes told him what her voice could not. She was moved beyond speech, her heart both breaking and mending at once. They sat there, hands clasped, the firelight wrapping them in its warmth. Outside the storm passed, the land breathing in relief. Inside, a different storm had broken, a storm of silence giving way to confession, of loneliness surrendering to love. In the quiet of that night, two souls, once strangers, found shelter not just in walls of wood, but in each other. And in that fragile, trembling moment, they both knew the truth, that sometimes the greatest love begins not with passion's fire, but with the simple, unshaken act of staying. The story pauses here, as though written in the margins of an old diary, but it leaves behind a truth that lingers like smoke after flame. That love does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it enters on broken ribs and children's pleas, and it blooms quietly, steady as a hearth fire against a storm. And if you listening now have carried loneliness across your own plains, may you remember that shelter is possible, even in the unlikeliest of cabins. So if this story has touched your heart, let it live beyond these words. Leave a mark, share a thought, let others know you walk these plains with us. And tell me, from where do you watch tonight?